can't think of many more words in today's society that cause more confusion and more disagreements than the word racism. So today I wanted to talk about what I think are acceptable levels of racism, and the reason I bring this up really is because a lot of dialogue I hear on racism today just seems completely stupid to me. I mean, the fact that only certain races can talk about racism to me tells you everything you need to know. I mean, I can kind of talk about this because I'm half Korean, but even then, Asians are almost being grouped in together with whites and accused of having white privilege. So we're even getting to the point where I can't talk about racism. And I've felt this firsthand. When I was in college, I specifically wrote an op-ed to the school newspaper because there was a racist event on campus, and going to the University of Alabama with the historical track record that university has, along with just being in the South, I saw something happen. I didn't think a lot of white students felt comfortable speaking up, so I thought, well, what the hell? I'll throw my opinion in the mix. And it was pretty well received, but the fact that it takes somebody like me to speak up and give a voice to other people who have voices but can't give their voice, to me tells you just about everything you need to know about racism. In addition to that, stupidity, there's also the idea that any sort of racial disparity automatically means there's racism. I mean, tech is probably the most notorious example today, given the gender and race gaps within technology, within STEM fields. But we don't ask these questions about other fields. We don't ask why there's racial disparities within NASCAR, why there's racial disparities within the NBA. We tend to just assume these are like natural occurrences. Well, that's just what happened. We don't go around asking why black people aren't interested in NASCAR, or if there's some sort of top-down movement to get blacks out of NASCAR. It just kind of is understood as a fact. And with these two things combined, this has the potential for some very serious effects going forward. We're talking about effects on society, legislation that I think could really lead us back to some sort of separate but equal society, but just from a different rationale. So before we go further, I need to clarify a few things, and that's first the definition of racism, and then also the distinction or the difference between what I call public and private racism. So the first thing we need to do is just define racism. What is it? Well, if you go to the dictionary, racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior, or the belief that all members of each race possess characteristics or abilities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race or races. In other words, terms like reverse racism are bullshit. It's just racism. It has nothing to do with political power. It has everything to do with believing that one race is superior or inferior to another race. What racism isn't are statements like, no offense, but I don't think Korean food is good. I've actually been in conversations where somebody said that and somebody else came in and said, whoa, dude, that's racist. No, it isn't. Just because it includes a country or just because it includes a race and it's something negative doesn't mean it's racist. Or things like, I don't find Koreans to be particularly attractive. Again, not racist. It's just a preference. I can't explain why I like certain things in women any more than I can explain why I like chocolate ice cream more than strawberry. I just do. That's it. The second thing we need to address is the difference between public and private racism, because conversations about racism can quickly transition from one to the other. You could be talking about a private business owner and their right to discriminate against others, and then within a few minutes, that conversation transitions to incarceration rates, drug arrests, the racial disparities, and it's like those two are different things. One is a private individual who is free to interact with whoever they want. The other is the government, for the people, by the people, funded by taxpayers. So if I walk into a bakery and they say they don't want to serve me, that's okay. I don't have a right to their services. If they don't want to associate with me, okay. But when I go to the DMV and they say, hey, you're Asian, you guys suck at driving, get out, that's not fucking cool. Because one, they're the only people who can issue driver's licenses, and two, I'm paying into the system. I don't have a choice. I have to do it, otherwise I'm thrown in jail. So the fact that I'm paying into the system and then they can discriminate against me when I fund them, that's a big fucking difference. The private individuals who own their own business, you don't have to interact with them in the same way they don't have to interact with you. Now that we've addressed the definition of racism and the difference between public and private racism, I can now move forward to my acceptable levels of racism. And I approach this from a libertarian perspective as principled as I can. So I'm going to focus on unalienable rights, life, liberty, and property. To take somebody's life, to take my life, would be murder. To take my liberty would be slavery. And to take my property would be theft. So if your racism does not violate these, it's really hard for me to say that anything should be done, that action should be taken against that person. If somebody just says blacks are inferior to whites or Asians are inferior to whites, they haven't murdered me, they haven't physically harmed me in any way, they haven't taken away my liberty, and they haven't taken away any property. What can I honestly do? What can I say that they've done wrong against me other than say something that I disagree with? Or if somebody who has an Airbnb, there was a famous example not too long ago, somebody has an Airbnb and then they say, oh, no Asians in my house. What harm have they actually done against me? Again, they haven't murdered me, they haven't harmed me physically in any way, they haven't taken my liberty, and they haven't taken my property. If anything, me saying they have to rent their house out to me is being entitled to their property. I'm actually stealing from them, even if it's just temporarily, but I'm saying, hey, because of my Asianness, I'm now entitled to your Airbnb for this weekend. To me, that makes no sense. And also another example would be a company with no Asian representation. There are some people who think something needs to be done. The government should step in and counteract this. But they haven't done anything. They haven't harmed anybody. So for those reasons, when you haven't harmed somebody's life, their liberty, or their property, it's very hard for me to make the case that some sort of corrective action should be done when no harm has occurred. In the context of racism in the private sphere, like the Airbnb host discriminating against me because I'm Asian, I can disagree with what they're doing and still respect their right to do it. I can be angry, frustrated, infuriated, while also defending their rights. Because for me to look to the government and force my moral standard upon them is a form of slavery. I'm saying, hey, I don't like what they're doing. Government, step in and make them do it. It's not the worst form of slavery, but it's still slavery. And how is that any different than forcing me to interact with businesses I don't want to interact with? Why does that only go one way? I knew people growing up who thought interracial marriage was wrong. They actually had a hierarchy of races. They thought whites marrying Asians wasn't as bad as whites marrying blacks. And the reason I know this is because they told me. I went to school with them. I was in the same classes as them. They sat next to me in class and they told me this straight to my face. And guess what? It didn't make me happy. I didn't like it. But what right do I have to silence them? They didn't attack me. They didn't enslave me. They didn't steal my shit. They didn't dox my family. They didn't harass my mom. They had thoughts that I didn't agree with. But I like to think that somebody like me actually had a positive impact on them because I was willing to engage in dialogue with them even when I disagreed with everything that they said and I didn't like it and it made me angry. But I think I was able to change their perspective just a little bit because they got to know me as a person who also happens to be half Korean. This approach is not only just more objectively moral, but I think it has the greatest potential for change. Because people aren't going to change unless they truly believe it and unless they want to change. And criminalizing words as hate speech or criminalizing discrimination does nothing more than force people to act a certain way. And honestly, I'd rather live in a nation of jerks than one of forced politeness that in reality is just complete fucking bullshit.